Okay, thank you. So I want to give the highlights of the infrastructure master plan. There are some things from both the existing conditions and also our infrastructure planning work that I think are important just to touch on today. So just as a guiding principle here, the infrastructure master plan is supporting the DMC vision, and our goal is to identify the capital improvement projects that support that plan, look at how that investment is made, and find a way to integrate that into the city's capital improvement plan. What I'd like to do is talk about the 4 key areas that we have looked at infrastructure. First one is obvious, it's kind of the streets and utilities. Second category is parks and open space. We're also looking at parking. We'll talk about some numbers about existing and proposed parking. And we've also looked at parcel development, which you could consider to be more of a private investment element, but we've looked at the cost associated with private investment, private parcel development, and how maybe the DMC could help with incentives to take care of some of the parcel development costs. So I've got a number of maps that I don't intend for you to see the details, but I'd like to illustrate a few key things here in the existing conditions. First of all, from the beginning, our planning has taken into consideration historic properties. The city has completed a portion of study about historic properties that we know about, some National Historic Register properties, some that are eligible for, and others that may need further study. So based on the information we have today, we've overlaid that information on our master planning just to get a sense of where some of those properties are. We've looked at affordable housing to understand where maybe Section 8 housing is, so that we're not proposing developments on those properties unless we intend them to be there for some reason. And the river is an important element of this. The floodplain, how do we define a development that respects the river and the floodplain and all the planning and work that the city has done to keep the river functioning through downtown. And we've also overlaid some of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency sites that are known contamination sites. The good news there is we're not aware of any significant brownfields or Superfund sites. These are your garden variety environmental cleanup sites like dry cleaners and gas stations. It's important to know in downtown and even in southeast Minnesota that we're in a region that's considered to have karst topology, which means there's a lot of rock that underlies the ground that we stand on, and that rock is of a nature that when water starts infiltrating and flowing through it, it does tend to dissolve the rock in certain ways, and it leads to sinkholes and caves and springs and disappearing streams. And that's important for us to know, because if we're going to propose any stormwater management solutions that are going to put groundwater or put rainwater into the ground, we have to know something about how that infiltration might affect the stability of the ground. And also when it comes to excavation for maybe underground parking, what it might mean in terms of cost for underground parking. So it's important to know about karst. Existing parking, we have approximately 17,000 existing parking stalls that are off-street. Does not include the city on-street parking. Those 17,000 stalls, I don't expect you to see the numbers, but in terms of color, anything you see in blue is a Mayo parking lot. Anything you see in green is a city parking lot or structure. And anything you see in pink is generally a larger contract parking area. So about 17,000 stalls downtown, about 9,500 are Mayo, about 3,000 are city. And that's an important number to remember, because we'll come back to the new number of stalls that we're proposing to be able to accommodate in this plan. Another thing that's important to know about the existing conditions is the Skyway and subway system. There's been some discussion about that at past meetings, but generally the subway system, which if you can see it, it's hard to read from maybe where you're sitting. Subway system is primarily a private system that supports the Mayo Clinic and their patients and their employees. And then there's a Skyway system that primarily serves the government areas, whether it's Civic Center, Government Center, or public parking ramps, but also connects a lot of the retail areas in downtown. And then from an open space perspective, I think it's important to know, as Tom was alluding to, we've got a great system of regional parks and trails, but they don't really get into downtown. We do have Peace Plaza, we have the Annenberg Plaza, we have Central Park, and we have parks that are on the periphery like Soldiers Field. And we have Mayo Park kind of on the western side, but really not a lot of penetration of parks and trails into the downtown. So that's the overview of some of the existing conditions that are important to know. I'll touch quickly on the 4 areas of the infrastructure master plan and some of the things that are important to know there. From a street and utility perspective, We have looked at the capacity of existing systems. We've looked at age and condition of utilities and streets. We've looked at the proposed plan and how it might require relocation of some infrastructure, and have generally come up with a plan. And again, I don't expect you to see the details from where you're sitting, but just generally have a plan for both underground and above ground infrastructure that's covering a lot of the streets and public corridors in downtown. So the footprint of the infrastructure plan is extensive, and maybe it represents 20 to 25% of all of this DMC boundary in terms of projects that we've identified. For parking improvements, we've talked about the need to develop around 16,000 net new parking stalls. So between the 17,000 stalls we talked about before, plus 16,000, we're up around 33,000 total parking stalls in downtown. And that, again, that does not include any of the on-street parking, which range in the neighborhood of, I think, 1,700 on-street parking stalls. The idea of integrating parking into our plan, Tom gave some pretty dramatic ideas of how parking could be incorporated if it was just dropped on the scene in some very easily digestible ways. But what we spent time doing is integrating parking into the plan that EEK has come up with, and tried to find ways to screen and shield from view the parking reservoirs. And of course, most parking in this plan would be structured parking. So some images here on the slide indicate storefront looking parking ramps that you would rarely expect. Behind those storefronts are structured parking stalls. So that's the idea of what this plan is trying to achieve, but certainly not in all cases will we be able to achieve that kind of a look for parking. And this image gives a sense of where we found homes for parking. I won't worry too much now about discussing the colors, but at least shows you the locations that structured parking has found a way to integrate with the development plan as it currently stands. From a parcel development perspective, we've looked at the cost to acquire property, to demolish buildings and existing features on parcels. We've looked at the cost to remediate the underground contaminants, and we've looked at the cost maybe for some site preparation costs that might be considered ways that DMC dollars could incentivize certain development. It's interesting, as we've looked at the locations where the development plan currently lands on existing parcels, the nature of the land uses that are on those parcels today. So this graphic shows in blue those existing land uses that are parking, and surface parking in particular. So it gives a sense that there's a lot of blue on this map, and that also indicates that we're repurposing land that now has surface parking to other uses that are higher density and integrates parking in a better way. Pink indicates buildings. So you can see that there are a certain number of buildings that are on parcels that are currently contemplated for development. But you could talk about what the impact is to those. It's much smaller than impacting the existing parking. And then green and yellow represent, green represents green areas, open space that primarily are getting repurposed, not converted to any development. And then yellow are parking ramps that would be demolished and then their parking replaced as part of the plan. And then last section I wanted to talk through is park and open space. So there are a lot of big ideas in the EEK master plan about anchoring large public spaces. As a part of that, there's a need to connect those spaces with streets and streetscapes and trails and other things. There are pocket parks. We may find opportunities along the way to find irregular parts of land that could be dedicated as public space and complement the overall park and open space plan. So generally, if you think about what the downtown park and open space plan might look like, if you can kind of see in this drawing from a distance, we've got a city loop trail that's knitting together some of the regional trails. We've got some downtown really dynamic public spaces that can be connected by the Crescent Trail and by other on-street features, the city loop trail, that really brings the park and open space plan into the downtown. And then just one more point I wanted to mention about technology. As a team, we are thinking about what the future holds for technology and ideas that we can't even comprehend today about how technology will be part of Rochester. And one thing we have learned when we've talked to the private utility companies that have communications infrastructure is that there is a significant amount of fiber optic investment already in Rochester. I've been told, and we could talk details, but there is, from a fiber optic cable capacity, more capacity than Rochester might be able to use in any long-term scenario, but the limiting factor for bandwidth in Rochester is the switchgear at the ends of the fiber optic lines. So as Rochester grows and has greater demand for higher bandwidth and higher speed communications, it doesn't require ripping up the streets. It does require upgrading switchgear at specific nodes. So I think in terms of a technology platform, I think I think Rochester is really well positioned for that.
Thank you, Dan.
Yep.
Thank you. So just a comment before we do questions. This is somewhere in between more or less information that you need or want to know. But it's really hard to put hours and months of planning into a presentation. But the important thing is that you have the confidence and the understanding of the business rigor behind this plan. So there's a lot of analysis and rigor behind the plan. We wanted to give you some snapshots of it so that you can have the, it's true, it's really your plan. So we need to make sure that you are confident in this as we are moving forward. So with that, I will open it up for any questions on the infrastructure or anything before that. Did you ever think you'd know so much about parking?
I just have a quick question. We were just kibitzing over here a minute ago. I'm sort of back on the streetcar thing. Like, order of magnitude, what would be the total investment likely for a streetcar circulator? Are you getting to that in a minute? Okay, great. You can see.
That's our next
Yep.
presenter.
Okay.
I have one quick question for Dan. Thanks for making infrastructure sound so interesting.
You're kind of a geek.
Yeah. You did just say, though, originally you said 17,000 current spots, and you said 9,500 mail and 3,000 city. What the rest, like private or?
The rest are contract
Contract.
or, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
I'm kind of intrigued, and I just had an article that I got in some transit magazine on these, I don't know what the right term is, but parking ramps that are robotic. And, 50% more cars in the same amount of space. And somebody had done a test somewhere that the ease of getting cars out, it was quicker actually than people driving them out. Have you guys done research on that, and what's the potential? I mean, if we want to do something that's kind of a wow, that would be pretty cool.
That's right. I can't say I'm the expert. I think there are folks here who have some of that expertise.
Yeah, we've worked on projects that have built those.
There are some in the United States?
Oh yeah, actually fairly common in denser urban areas. San Francisco, Denver, New York all have that. City of Boulder is actually building a big downtown mixed-use development project, kind of on scale with a lot of what we're talking about here. And they're doing all the parking with robotic parking. Cost differential when you look at it from the standpoint of spatial costs and the new infrastructure actually can be somewhat of a wash. Because you're paying more for the infrastructure, but you're using a heck of a lot less space. So we've actually are developing a memo that we're going to include in the appendix to the report that discusses that.
The mayor and I were kibitzing a little bit about that. I mean, to me, it seems it would make sense globally for the clinic. You have so many employees coming down with a parking crunch. I mean, if they could drop their car off and walk to work, and the robot puts their car away, and when they're getting ready to go home, they just, they hit their computer, they log out or whatever, they tap, and here comes the guy, they get down there and the car's sitting right there, and ready to go, and it seems like you could cram more cars into some of the structures we already have.
Yeah, there's places that are using them outside. There's some lots in downtown Denver where they actually use them in an outside parking lot as well. We can get into a lot of detail on it. There's true robotic systems where you get that kind of, on touch delivery. A lot of them are actually valet parks, so they're great for hotels and downtown environments where you actually have an operator or somebody coming and getting the car. So yeah, it's definitely something that we're worth looking at. And something they typically get into at the next phase of a design for a specific development.
Mary, did you ever see the cartoon Jetsons? Well, the Jetsons is today.
Yeah.
Believe it, I never thought I'd really be here.
Yeah.
Today.
But you don't need space.
Anything else for Dan?
Just slide them in.
All right, we're switching gears, and Amy's gonna
I had a little technical difficulty earlier and had to drop one more slide in that took a half an hour. So thank you, everybody. So as you know, what this has all been leading up to is the finance plan. And over the course of the last several meetings, actually, you all have been asking for exactly this. So the work we have done in the planning to establish the master plan and the vision for this and the transportation plan and the work that Dan has done to set cost models on everything has really led to a very good foundation and base of assumptions here. And so I'm going to spend about 4 hours going through the finance plan. Hope you're ready for that.
Turn out the lights when you leave.
So, yes, exactly. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was the district overview, because that is really what establishes the backbone, if you will, of what makes up the finance plan. The development district, what the law requires is that a development district be created. And the purpose of the development district is to identify the area in which investment is measured. So if you all remember, investment gets measured Mayo Clinic within the city, and private investment within the district boundary. So the district boundary really helps to determine the formula which ultimately determines how much funding is available from the state. The district area also establishes the area in which these funds, the $585 million of DMC funds, can be invested. So this is a very important area. We had previously selected and proposed back in, I think it was July, when we first put it out formally. And we had identified an area that was based on a couple of key things. The first was that it represented the area that the city identified in its RDMP plan. So it represented an area that the city had already said, this is where a lot of growth, particularly growth in employment, and downtown living is going to happen, and where Mayo Clinic's growth is going to happen. We also incorporated the area that is part of Mayo Clinic's master plan, because again, we want to recognize the area where the highest demands exist for patients, for visitors, and for residents and commuters coming to the downtown area. We then worked with the city, and we refined the boundary of that was shown to kind of push and pull it based on what made the most sense for picking up. So for instance, we went out to Highway 52 and picked up the interchange there, or we went a little north and a little south. We put the area out for public comment in in September. And then we asked for comment through October, both from the public and from the city. And we received a lot of good comments and feedback. We then reviewed with the city and talked a little bit about the areas that we would change and amend. And that was in your board packets that came out. And what you see in the little clouded boxes are the areas that we determined were the best areas for the amendment. So we included, on the east side, we included a little block area just to pick up some parcels and go to the street. We went north and south on Broadway, mostly to pick up highway and gateway improvements in those areas. And then we went a little bit west to pick up an area that's had a lot of interest and discussion about redevelopment. So those were the areas that we were proposing for the change. I will tell you, yesterday we had some more discussions with the city, and they had requested that we also consider on the north and south clouds. Well, actually, I'll split this. On the north-south that we go a half a block east and west, just to pick up. If we're going to, think about gateway improvements, we should also think about the edge of those streets and not just the street. And to also think of that area on the west side of the south extension on Broadway, again, just to pick up the gateway improvements that are development improvements. And they thought, as we look at that, maybe that would be a smart thing to do. And so I wanted to try and just facilitate a little discussion around this area with all of you to get your feedback and thoughts, and if you think we're in the right direction, then this is what we'll put in the plan. We'll go survey it, and it will become part of what's in the plan. The only other thing that I would mention before we get into the discussion is that under the law, the area is not set once and then is not able to be amended. What will happen over time is there will be discussion about new areas or expanded areas off of this, and there is a process contemplated in the law that allows that to happen. So you can have more than one district. You can amend the districts really at any time. There's no trigger for that. So this doesn't have to be a final decision. This is just a decision about where we're going to start. Finally, there have been, as we've looked at projects, there have been a lot of requests that have come in. Some of those requests look at areas outside of the district boundaries. And what we've talked about with city staff has been there are going to be projects that are going to require the boundary to be amended just for those projects. So for instance, if you expand a utility line inside the district boundary, but the actual connection point of that utility line is outside the district boundary, we're going to have to amend the district boundary to go along that utility line if we want to use DMC funds to fund a portion, all or a portion of that. And so there are where those areas have come up and those funding or projects have come up in discussion, what we've all sort of collectively agreed to is that as those projects come forward on a distinct basis, they would be reviewed on a distinct basis. And you would recommend a shift in the area when the project came forward. So I hope that is clear. So going back to this image, I guess I thought I would just open it up and see if there's any feedback and input to this.
Thank you. Probably this is more a question than a comment, but it would strike me that the portals into the major district would be important to include in the district, because we just heard a lot about the importance of transportation being appropriately attended. So that's my interpretation, but I'm ready to have experts tell me why that's wrong. The second thing is I think it'll be critical that the DMCC and the city, and we want to support this, have very clearly articulated principles and criteria to define what's in the zone, because otherwise it will be an unmanageable challenge. For the first definition, you talked about some principles, and that was this is where the development, the expenditures are most likely to occur, so that's where we ought to be sure and capture it and support it, et cetera. So that's a principle. And I think that's going to be very important since this is not a one-time decision.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Well, I'm, of course, most curious to know what the locals think about these lines.
Mm-hmm.
But I would just add that while I think it's important that we remember that we do have some flexibility over time, that we wouldn't take that to an extreme, or we would be adjusting this every time we felt like it. As the mayor just said, we don't want to have, district creep or zone creep, because so while there's flexibility, we also, I think, need to take the lines and where they're drawn very seriously, because we're not going to be adjusting them every 3 months.
I will tell you, when we put it out for comment, we didn't receive a ton of comments. I would say that I wouldn't say, probably 40% of the comments were just, makes sense. And then the comments that we did get, some of them got picked up. We got quite a few actually about Broadway and picking up Broadway up to 7th. A few that we got that I would say we probably had 2 or 3 about the Silver Lake plant and whether that should be included. And that was one where we had a really long dialogue about over time, whatever happens there is going to be a major redevelopment piece, and that's going to have its own set of challenges, project finances and what have you. And that's one, for instance, that it just made sense to wait until you knew more about what it was going to be rather than include it. Mm-hmm.
On a principal issue, to me, the presence of higher education in economic development is critical. It's not a principle, it's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the University of Minnesota of higher education in the district?
I would say the answer to that is yes. I think that what we've done in setting this boundary, and really as we evaluated it again throughout this process, is we looked at the core focus areas, the 7 core focus areas, learning being one of them, and really talk through where can we most concentrate the dollars to get the highest and best use of investment, but then also the biggest bang for our buck. Because if we want to try and concentrate this investment, we want to try and draw the boundaries, and in fact, a lot of us would even say the boundaries could be smaller here. And the reason for that is the circulator, for instance, can really support the growth of University of Minnesota Rochester in its location, and it's part of the district strategies that we have here. But that couldn't exist on its own just because of University of Minnesota Rochester. So we need to leverage and build off what is happening to create enough mass and demand to support the growth here.
If the University of Minnesota and the state of Minnesota decided to invest substantial capital in the next 20 years in the University of Minnesota Rochester, would that count as investment, as private investment?
I believe so, in the way the law is written.
I think we'd want to make sure of that since there'd be public dollars invested.
Mm-hmm. You may want to have your attorney, Kathleen, it would, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it's an accurate area, and the fact that we can adjust it if we need to makes me comfortable with it from the city's view.
Mm-hmm.
At an earlier meeting, I had suggested once, I don't even know if it was a suggestion or more of a comment, that when you go out west towards Cascade Lake, and there's a major parking lot there now that Mayo has, and I always kind of envisioned that's where that, whatever the streetcar or whatever should get all the way out there, not stop at 52, but was that considered at all?
It was. We actually discussed it with city staff. And that was another one of the projects that got on the list that at the time, if demand exists to bring the circulator out that far, and depending on what happens at Cascade Lake, that project would be looked at as a unique project, and then we would amend. So we did recognize and talk about that with city staff.
This question might be premature, and like always, you're going to talk about it later.
Of course we will.
But I just want to make sure we talk about it.
Sure.
These proposed, I'll call them remote parking garages so that there's not so many people downtown. Did you factor in your financing plan that they would be a fee for parking there?
Tom?
The truly remote facilities, i.e. the facilities that are on the outskirts of the city of Rochester, would likely not be a fee for park type model. Typically with that type of park and ride where you've got somebody in their car, pretty tough to capture them if they're required to pay at that point.
Well, where I was going with that is if you remote park and then you get to ride a streetcar downtown, you need to collect a fee someplace.
So the sort of inner peripheral parking facilities that are on the edge of downtown,
Right.
we assume those likely would be part of a paid parking system if they were public supply. And so, I think as we explore the streetcar operations, its integral role with the parking system is potentially part of the overall financing and management solution to that. So the difference between the lots on the outskirts of the city versus those that are connected by the streetcar.
If I were a consumer and I had to pay a fee for parking, but included in that was a ride downtown, might not be so difficult to pay the fee. In addition to that, it might be a source to sell revenue bonds where you could add on to the state funding and wouldn't count against that. It could be
That's right.
used in addition to that. But you'd have to run the numbers to see if it works. I don't know.
Right.
So bonding against parking revenue is actually a pretty common.
Yes, it is.
A common way to fund transit projects, i.e. streetcar
I'm-
projects.
Now, is that coming up later?
We're going to talk about it next year.
All right.
To answer your question, the financing mechanism for the garages is discussed in a moment, and we are also working through the O&M strategy, which includes this notion of how are we going to support the operation and maintenance of the transit improvements. And I think what's the number for the circulator every year for operating? Do you recall? It's like $2 million.
$2 million at build-out, could be lower with the initial proposal that we put on the table.
So there are, in going through that, what we're identifying is operating revenues that come from private users, operating revenues that come from private uses through these sort of district ideas where you're offsetting building parking, the cost of building parking because you have a commuter program, and we can offset some of those costs. So we are building the model. So to answer your question specifically about operations, you will see that later. We haven't gotten it done yet. But you're going to see the cost part of it today.
Need the other half, too.
Yeah.
I was tag on a comment with his first, and then make a comment about the boundary. I guess the question I'd have about is it going to be integrated? Is the parking cost of providing the parking, of building the parking, going to be integrated with the cost of providing the transit? Are they going to be separate line items? Are they going to be
They're together.
One system? So then it's more of a policy or strategy than how we pay for that. If you charge for the parking and you get the free, or you pay for the bus ride and you park for free, it's all going to be in the cost structure, and the revenue model will take both into consideration.
That's right.
Okay. Then the comment I was going to make about the boundary, I think you can make an argument. This is a very difficult thing to do. I understand that. You can make an argument for expanding that a little bit to the north there on the west, or a little bit farther to the east. But I would say that I think you've done a pretty good job of kind of capturing the essence of that at this point in time. And if demand creates some sort of cause to go back and, like you say, look at the boundary, then you got that built into the process. Like I said, I could make an argument for doing it, but I'd say you did a pretty good job of.
So keep it like this,
Yeah,
and then if the demand exists.
I support what you've got there. I could make an argument and do more, but I don't know that. But
I'm for keeping it small and expanding it as needed, but again, sort of thinking logically about this whole thing, if your big transit hub is going to be on the north end, wouldn't you expect that the welcome to visitors would be from that north piece? And it seems like we're neglecting that and using 2nd Avenue as our sort of entry into the city. I'm just not sure about that, because that seems to be the thing that comes into the transit center.
This here, pardon me, is Civic Center Drive coming in,
Right.
and that's really the main connector.
Main
This
connector.
is,
that's 19th.
That's
I'm
going
sorry?
to be
Is that 19th up there, isn't it?
Yeah, or 7th. That's 7th.
19th's way at the top, isn't it?
19th's way up. This is 7th up here.
No, that's 7th Street there?
Yeah, that's 7th Street.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to?
Well, I was just gonna respond in terms of
It looks farther up.
transit entry. Even though the transit center's on the north, I think we expect that there'll still be a lot of the transit entry to downtown that comes in on 2nd, just because of the kind of nature of the demand, where there's a major hub at St. Mary's and a major hub downtown. So there may be a point in the future where, some of the routes coming out of smaller communities are, there's actually enough demand that you could go point to St. Mary's and to the transit central station. But probably in the, next 10 or 15 years, most of those services will still naturally want to come by St. Mary's and do a pickup drop-off before they come into downtown.
And this here, that whole central station concept exists right here. And so our idea is to bring people into this major gateway and to actually change that experience pretty radically from what it is today and make it monumental. Because we do think that that is something that should be recognized as part of this plan, because it is a major entry point. And I think through our discussions, we've tried to recognize the north, the south, and the West Connection in particular, that as those points, and not just focus on Second, but recognizing that as the main artery. Yep. Okay. Well, we will then proceed with this and move to a final on it. The DMC funding model, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because at various times we have talked about this with folks, but the funding model, just to sort of ground everybody again, is based on an estimated investment of $5.6 billion, and that is what we are trying to incent to have happen here. That's we want to leverage the 585 to incent economic development to occur. The public investment that was approved in the legislation was $585 million. Approximately $455 of that is in general state aid, which approximately $128 million of that comes from the city. Then there's about $116 million that comes in the form of state transit aid. So there's two different buckets. There's a general aid and a transit aid. And so you'll see, to your question, Gary, are you looking at transit improvements as a whole? We are. And that's the reason, because we're dividing between these two buckets of money. Of the 116, approximately 47 million comes from the county, and then there's a sales tax exemption, which makes up the balance of the 585, which is estimated to be about $14 million over time. We have, for the purposes of modeling, assumed that the 14 million applies to the public infrastructure part and not the transit part. There's no reason it couldn't apply to both, but we just sort of we've looked at it this way. From a modeling perspective. Also, for the state funding to become available, we have to see $200 million of investment in the local market. The public infrastructure is broadly, the term public infrastructure is broadly defined in the legislation, and that was intentional. The reason for that is this is an economic development initiative, so we want to support what most people would think of as public infrastructure, streets and sewers and roads and lights and things like that. But we also want to be able to use the money to incent and catalyze development to occur. And so with the funding, the term public infrastructure allows us to do it allows us a lot of economic development tools. We can acquire real property and other assets, demolish and rebuild and repair. We can remediate land. We can build parking facilities, which we've talked a lot about today. But we can basically put the deal structures together to make economic development. We can also do the traditional public infrastructure. And in particular, you'll see in the plan that there's a lot of supporting infrastructure that is part of this. But it was intentional. It is meant to give you all the right tools to get what you need done to really realize this vision. The funding model is based on a program. AECOM put together a market analysis, which led to a program and absorption model in the 7 core districts, and we estimated, what could occur over time in the market, and that led to an estimation of the investment that would occur in each of these areas. We then broke that down into phases, looking at how much investment we thought could occur in each phase. And then through a formula that's in the legislation, we then estimated how much money would be available to spend in each phase. So what a lot of people don't understand about this bill is that the 585 isn't available tomorrow. We have to put private investment in, and I think Mr. Bell, you had said this earlier in the meeting. You wanted to make sure that the private investment was happening and that these things were coordinated. This bill is set up to do that very thing. So as private investment occurs, public investment becomes available over time. There are other factors that influence how much money is available. There are caps on how much investment can come from the state at any given period. And so only so much money can be taken down every year. But then those caps are also set by a matching investment from the city and the county. So there's a push-pull here, and we've been working with the city's finance staff and meeting with the city and county planning department to really determine what do we think is a viable model here in setting expectations for what the investment could be over time. And I think we've landed on this as a good framework of what could occur. So in the early years, we're expecting that we'll have $40 to $60 million available and for public infrastructure and 10 to 15 for transit. This is important because a lot of people have said, wow, that's a big vision. And what we have to realize is we have to strategically invest in projects and in public infrastructure in order to realize that vision over time, but it's not all going to happen tomorrow. So,
Amy, where does the federal, transit money fit into this model? Are you getting to that?
I'll get to that next year. So, no, that's next. So I wanted to kind of ground us. Does anybody have any questions about sort of how this works in setting that? Yeah.
I just have a question on the, you said the state funding is available after $200 million of private investment. How is this accessible? Is this a slow trickle, or is it just is like now once you get there, then, is it kind of come in a little bit at a time, or how does that money become accessible?
Do you want to answer that, or you want me to? Okay. What happens is in April of every year, we will work with the city to certify the private investment that has happened, and that comes one of two ways. Mayo Clinic actually reports out its investment because it can happen anywhere in the city, and then we'll work with the city's planning department and the city clerk to take building permits and then estimate what the investment is from building permits for private investment. That's the plan, at least. So every year we'll certify it in April, and I believe it's September when DEED will come back and confirm that. So it happens once a year.
An additional thought here is that that's precisely what the DEED issue is about, and it's whether they are certifying against an annual amount of private investment or whether they are certifying against a cumulative amount of private investment. And so the total amount is going to depend on how that discussion comes out.
This is based on a cumulative?
Yes.
projection,
Yeah.
based on a cumulative?
Yeah. If it was annual, it'd be much more. Yes. This model doesn't work very well if the technical fix doesn't happen.
I think that's what Mr. Raybeck was referring to earlier today then when he talked about the difference in this and his model of talking about how you build a house, a whole bunch at once, or, so I hope it certainly makes sense, but we'll see.
That's right. Anything else? Yes.
I would just point out, and it really picks up on the point Mr. Bell was making, there's also a need and an obligation to secure additional funding. So there is not only what we anticipate with the private investment as we might envision it now, but going out after other sources and going for federal money and looking at the creative models or the appropriate models available to fund specific projects. So this is necessarily incomplete, and we have an obligation to add to it.
Well, thank you. That's actually the perfect segue. If you're all ready to move to the next section, I will do so. So the finance plan is set up to do exactly what Dr. Simmons just said and what many of you have said. The investment model here, it's a $6 billion plan. A lot of the plan has private elements to it, and a lot of the plan has public elements to it. And in fact, a lot of the plan blends those two things. Because we can't get everything we want to get done here if the private and public sector don't work together. So shared parking is a good example of that. In a shared parking model, you have to get the development community to buy into shared ramps, and that's going to be a pretty radical shift. It can be done. Other cities have done it. It's the smartest way to do it because you get more efficiency out of the ramps and those sorts of things. But everybody, I think, from the best practice trips, what we learned is what other cities have that we point to and say are best practices is everybody works together, and this has got to happen in this model for this to work. So What the finance plan's purpose is to set a strategic framework for the projects over a 20-year period. We have a phase 1 plan, which is a capital improvement plan, which estimates the available funding for transit projects and public infrastructure projects. That's what you just saw. So we'll estimate how much we'll have available. To the extent feasible, we'll identify projects that we believe are going to come forward right away, or that we know are going to come forward right away. Those are mostly city public projects that we'll actually include and say, we know there's a desire to go forward with these in the near term, and these should be considered as part of this strategy and these funding guidelines. And then we'll outline an economic development strategy for what we want to incent early. This is the phasing strategy that we talked about earlier, because I think in each of these phases, your strategy is going to change. Early on, I think what you'll likely want to focus on is Discovery Square and really incenting the bioscience to take hold. And you'll want to think about what's happening at the convention center and really the visitor experience. And you'll want to think about what's happening at the core. But frankly, some of the stuff at St. Mary's might happen later, because that's all dependent on what happens with Mayo and where their plans are and those sorts of things. So you'll have to look and evaluate at those these elements within the development plan. And the development plan is actually set up to be a living document. It gets updated every 5 years so that you all can evaluate the strategies as it goes. Are we doing the right thing or not? We will also, within the development plan, establish protocols and evaluation criteria, and we're going to talk about that later, so I won't spend too much time on it. And then it provides a flexible and responsive market-driven model. The finance plan methodology identified projects. So what we did is we went through and we took Peter's plan and we took Tom's plan and we identified all the projects that could come out of that plan, and then we put costs to it. And Dan and Tom's team have been particularly wonderful for doing that. We then worked with the city staff to identify projects that they thought would want to be considered as part of the DMC plan. We then cross-checked those to try and figure out where things were duplicative and not, so that we weren't over-counting costs, and have been working back and forth to do that. And that, to be honest, that process is still going on. We then identified sources of revenue, the 585 obviously, but then other public and private sources. And then we've reconciled known changes to previous assumptions. And what that means is, back in the legislative session, for those of you who were involved in this, you'll remember that we did an infrastructure master plan that sort of estimated on an order of magnitude basis what the costs might be. While this is a much different plan now, we actually have a plan now. This was order of magnitude, sort of what types of investment might fit into this and what the gap might be. We are now applying the left-hand side of the column to what actually is the master plan and the transportation plan strategy. So ignore that column. But what this shows you is what we did in each of these areas is we went through and we identified different sources. We identified CIP funding, federal funding, hotel tax, non-DMC sales tax, et cetera. And that got us to the gap that we needed for the DMC funding. That's how we identified what the DMC funding really was. One thing we've been working with city staff on is there was a different set of assumptions for city CIP funding and their investment in the DMC when this plan came forward. Through the legislative process, that changed. So what we've been doing is trying to reconcile those two columns with staff to make sure that we're not overcommitting funds, and that we recognize that there's only so much money available. And if it moves from one bucket to the other, you just don't get to add buckets. So we've been, as much as we would all like to. So we've been working really hard to get to that point, and I think we're there, actually. I think we've more than recognized the difference in funding that came over, and I think that's a very positive thing. This has a lot of text, so I'm sorry about that. But essentially, what this slide shows is where the current plan exists at a high level. So on the public infrastructure components, we think there's about $1.35 billion of total costs in public infrastructure, what we've defined in that category. And again, with the DMC funding, what we've recognized is $455 million of public infrastructure funds and then the 14 of sales tax abatement. We've then looked at the CIP that we had before, as well as sales tax and other dollars that might get spent in the downtown, because this is a comprehensive plan for the downtown. It's not like DMC elements make up, a quarter of this. It's a comprehensive plan of what could happen. We look at other state and federal sources that could flow into these things. We look at private investment, and then there's sponsorship dollars too. What we learned on our best practice trips is actually sponsorship dollars are a really important part of what happens here. And those can come from a lot of different places. So there's about $1.35 billion in public infrastructure. There's about $5.57 billion in transit and transportation costs, and that's where the $116 million of DMC funding lives. And in total, about $1.897. Pardon me. As Tom said, there's a lot of parking here, and we're gonna talk about that in a minute. If we loaded all of the private parking into this number would go up by about $600 million. Is that right? That might be much. That might be a little much. But if we didn't have the transit strategy at all, the parking number alone would be about $2 billion. So there are high demands and high costs here. So this is how we have started to break down the transit framework for phase one. So this is the question that you had, Tina, about the funding. So for the transit systems are really the circulator elements. And in the early phases of the project, what that really relates to is planning costs. And Tom can talk more about that. But you have to. There is extensive planning. There are rigorous federal requirements that you need to go through in order to justify the transit. So there's transit systems. We've then looked at the supporting bridges, roads, and parking that relate to transit improvements specifically, and put those in the funding. We have the urban connector and loop in here, an important piece of how people move throughout the city and how we incent economic development to happen in the city. And then signage and wayfinding. In phase one, we believe that the total cost of the improvements that Tom's plan has, I should say all of our plan, has for phase one is $30.9 million. And we are, I'm sorry, this should have been told, but we are recognizing about $11 million of total funds from the DMC. So we had said we believe there's 10 to 15 million available. So we're within the range of funding that we believe will be available for the DMC. And then we have to go out and find these other sources that can match that. For instance, the other state funding, what that is. We've looked at improvements on Broadway. That's something that could happen very early and have a very impactful change on the aesthetic of the downtown. There is state funding, MDOT funding for that. And the way we've set up this in the funding model is we've said that should be a little bit of the MDOT funding and it should be a little bit of the DMC funding. And we can really radically change the way that street functions, feels, looks, as a gateway to the community early on. And that's one of those projects. So when you see DMC funding and other state funding in that's what that is. You want me to stop? Okay.
Good tracking? Good tracking?
I'm tracking.
Okay. Checking.
Do you want to go around the table and see if we're tracking?
Did Jim fall off his chair over there?
He did, yeah.
Laying down on the table.
Wait, what were those circles?
Okay. Well, do you want me to get through everything and go back, or?
Either way, yeah.
Okay. So the public infrastructure funding. Transit is a little bit easier to define. These are big projects, and there's strategies, and they're phased. They're sort of more regimented in terms of the way you move forward. If you're going to go forward with a circulator, it's a defined area. You have to do planning before it, so you can really time out what that is. Public infrastructure in this plan is a little bit different because there are going to be a lot of demands on these funds. And everything we know today, the only thing I know is that everything we know today is wrong. And that this won't happen exactly as we've envisioned it. And so what we can do is we can estimate on an order of magnitude basis how this plan will come together. But there will be more demand for funds than there are funds. That is going to happen. And so what we've identified right now is about $210 million of funding that wants to occur in just phase one for public infrastructure projects. We've assumed we have 40 to 60 million of DMC funding, and if we don't find other funding sources, we're going to have 25 to 30 million of a funding gap, unless we wanted to do more CIP funding, which I don't think is something that's very well supported. So we've tried to hold the limits of what this is and really look at it. What does that mean for this project? Does it mean you don't get everything in the end? Well, no. What we've tried to do is establish the plan so that over time we can get everything that we want strategically. But we're going to have to move projects from phases. And we're going to have to evaluate projects as they come forward in this framework and really realize and think about what do we want to see happen. How do we strategically invest and how do we strategically save money, frankly, to go into projects as they occur? Because just in your first phase, without really trying, we've got a gap right now. And so those decisions will need to be made as we go forward. And so I thought this would be a good time to stop because we'll talk about the process that we're working on for the development plan to try and evaluate projects after this. But I wanted to just kind of stop and have a little bit of a discussion about how the models come together and what you all think about how it's structured in the methodologies.
I just had a question on page 15 of yours, which is the one before. Was it this one?
15 is 16.
This is 16, yeah, 15. I wasn't quite sure how this thing added up to 5.57 billion, or is that over time? Because
Yeah, this is the 20-year.
this is the 20-year, because the things in the middle don't add up to anywhere near that.
Mhm.
That's, okay. Okay, that was just a clarification. Thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Amy, is the category for other city, is that, is that above and beyond spending? Is it existing program dollars? I mean, explain to me a little bit about that.
So in the original infrastructure master plan, what we did is we went through and we looked at city CIP funding historically over a 20-year period and how much was dedicated to the downtown. And then we estimated in the original plan the $339 million came from an estimation of what the average spend was in the downtown over time, and then escalated that up to the years that we were counting, and then carried that out over the 20 years. So it's not assuming that there is any more funding than the city does today. The question is, can the city support the current level of funding over time? And the thought process is probably because your base is going to grow with this project, your population is going to grow with this project. And so we've just assumed that the investment strategies by the city, sort of remain constant. Now, that's something the city council will have to determine as it goes forward as well, and that number could ebb and flow over time as well.
A quick question on this slide. I think it was, you were talking about Broadway, that there was some turnback money that they'd have to invest from the state. It seems like that money was given to the city a while back to take care of like maintenance and the overall good of that roadway for years, not really invest in new things. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, is this something you've talked about, discussed obviously with the Public Works Department, that they would be able to invest this kind of money in this?
Yeah, we've had discussions about it from a theoretical basis, and then actually as recently as yesterday we had another conversation about the improvements. The fact is, the road needs improvements, and the money that was given for the MnDOT turnback was meant to aid in that, and this is the area where you'll have a lot of need for improvements in traffic coming and those sorts of things. That said, what we would do as the DMC project is probably beyond what you would normally do, and that's why we're saying that should be a blend of funds and the DMC should invest in that. Now, this isn't determining how those funds are used exactly today. This is a framework. But when that project comes forward and when we think about it in the context of what's happening with the DMC funding, those things would be, that project would be evaluated based on that. And we talked about the fact that we need to make sure that we save enough money. So I think in total it's like 6 million of the 26 million is thought to be in this like 15 block area.
Yeah, because I know it's a bigger area for a lot of years, so I want to make sure we're not just spending on one thing and then what do we do down the road?
That's right.
No pun intended.
Amy,
Sure.
is it, okay, so the DMC funds, that's based on the formula, based on the development, I get that. The other city, that's the normal cities' funds they use for capital improvements, their capital improvements planning, their CIP planning. You budget some of those, don't allocate them to this. And then the $20 million sales tax, is that what's in? Is that what's in there? And then, so the most, I guess the most uncertain dollars on there is the state, the other state and federal? Would that be the most?
I'll let Tom speak to the certainty of that and how that works, but I just want to clarify one thing. The DMC funding, so the 128 million, it's assumed that the 20 million of the DMC funding lives within that.
What's in the DMC column?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So
Sales tax on the other, that's why.
yeah, the sales tax that's in there. There was in the sales tax there was 8 million.
The other transportation pieces of it.
Right.
I'm with you. Okay.
Right.
I'm tracking.
Right. So, and again, it's one of those.
Directionally impaired, but-
It's one of those things where we look at the plan, and this is true of the CIP funding too, where we look at the plan holistically and we say, look, this is a plan for the downtown. So if the city has a need to reinvest in, we'll call it Second Avenue or Second Street, we should all coordinate. We should figure out the best places and the best ways to invest money over time. And is it something that the DMC funds should be used to help incent and develop? But that 8 million of roadway improvements, all the areas that would happen in, we've probably touched because we've touched most of the areas in the downtown. So we've trying to find that balance. You want to talk about federal?
Yeah, so, definitely some of the federal funds, particularly the transit capital funds that we've identified in the plan, are competitive application processes. So, there would need to be a subsequent planning effort, and so just take the streetcar project, for example. In order to enter a federalized process that would allow you to compete for those monies, there needs to be a next step in local planning and concept design, and the feds won't pay for that. So essentially what we're saying here is we're going to leverage some DMC or local monies to pay for that next step in order to enter into that federalized competitive process.
So those dollars, the cost of that step is built into this?
Yes,
Correct.
that is going to DMC. That's coming out of the DMC pool, and not the CIP pool.
Now, the other thing I would say about those monies is roughly 50% of the evaluation process that the feds go through to determine who they're to grant those monies to is based on a local finance plan. So having local contribution built into a locally adopted plan and actually having that money on hand, or a pretty good chunk of that money on hand, makes you much more competitive.
Sure.
So I'm hearing that when we're moving this into the model, that the parking is what's missing here. So that's why. But the numbers and the uses and sources. So I apologize for that, and we'll clean that up before we move on. So from the standpoint of the funding model, any other comments to the approach and methodology? And then I want to just talk for a second about this notion of the public infrastructure funding. Is that all right? Yes.
Just one quick question. So the transit hub is part of the public supporting infrastructure? Is that what the transit hub? Because I don't see that on your.
Yes.
That's part of the public infrastructure.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. We've loaded The transit improvements, the transit money has the circulator, all the supporting roads, bridges, et cetera, for the circulator, the supporting structures, so the transit hub, any stations, as well as the park and ride lots, and then signage and wayfinding, and the loop connector that we talked about a little while ago. That's all part of the transit strategy. And again, those are all pretty well defined in terms of scope and cost based on the modeling that we have. And then the infrastructure, the public infrastructure piece would be a little, will change and morph over time.
I can't really give you a real definitive answer on the questions, quite honestly. I mean, I can react to what I've seen up here, but I don't think we've been provided we've been provided so we can actually look at it and study it, which, I mean, take some time to digest this. And
yeah. And the reason for that,
I assume it does.
Yeah.
I assume that it does, but, you know,
I'm not
if you want me
asking-
to do definitive,
Yeah.
I need to really have some time to look at it and study it. And
You have time, Gary.
right.
That's why we're introducing it today. so
okay.
Yeah, I mean, what we're really trying to get to today is just an like a general feedback and reaction to how it's coming together, the process that we're,
Format-wise, process-wise, I
Right.
think it all makes sense,
right,
you know.
right.
on the
Then we can go and, then we'll go and finalize it, and then you'll have more, we'll put it.
Because this is really important. This is really
Well, this is it. I mean, this is, yeah, this is as important as it gets. And, as you know, we're working at a very rapid pace to try and get this all put together and defined. And so what we're really, again, trying to understand from you today is, does the methodology make sense? Then we can go finalize the numbers. That's as long as the methodology makes sense and we don't have to totally change our methodology.
I can answer yes to that,
Okay.
at least from my perspective.
Yeah.
I would just, from my perspective, the approach of looking at this by phases is a very helpful way of doing it. And I think I'm also really appreciative of the comment that you're making that in order to put together this kind of analysis you've had to make, you're essentially trying to model economic growth in this downtown of Rochester over the next 20 years and then figure out how you might pay for that growth that you've just modeled. So it is, you've had to make many, many assumptions in order to be able to do this. And so I just want to say how much I appreciate the complexity of the modeling effort that has gone into this. And I'm sure that when you kind of take it to the next level, you'll lay out what all those assumptions are, so that we can understand them better. And always, this is a question of every assumption has risks associated with it, and I don't think that anybody here is trying to would want you to sort of say with definitively that all the assumptions will for sure come true. But it's extremely helpful as a strategic exercise to lay this out, because with this in mind, we can then actually start to have a strategic conversation about where our investments ought to go and where we're going to get the most leverage. And
Exactly.
And I'm really, really appreciative of that. And the last point I want to make is that this sort of looks at it from the perspective of where the money would go, and I know that you're also working on how we finance it. Not only where does the money come from, but as Jerry is suggesting, how much of this is bonding, how much of this is other bonding that might, revenue bonding, for example. And so that is like the fourth dimension of what is already a very complicated model, but I know that that's also going to be really important for us all to understand.
Yes, thank you. And one of the things that I would just stress, as we talk about the change or the debate that's happening around the law and the cumulative versus annual, that does impact your ability to do bonding, because it has to do with guaranteeing revenue streams. And if it's annual and you can't count the revenue streams going forward, it doesn't work. So it's pretty important.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we will proceed. You will get more, as always, you will get more information than you ever wanted to know about assumptions on these things, but it's important, and I assure you we are sitting with staff and really going through these assumptions and vetting them in detail. I got one more thing. I know. Well, you have good news. So the evaluation criteria. I want to spend a minute on this because I think as you go forward, this is a strategic discussion. And I think one of the things that's going to be really important for all of you is that you have a standardized methodology in place to really look at these projects. So we have spent in the team a lot of time and effort trying to figure out how do you compare a city utility project against catalytic development, against a public improvement on the waterfront, and how do you really sort of weigh those things in the context of this plan and strategy and methodology. And we've tried very hard, and again, this is something we need to provide you, but I just want to give you a sense of it. We're providing it to the city as well, and over the next several weeks going through it with them, and they've already influenced some of the thinking on this, but we're trying to find a standardized method so that essentially when projects come forward, what the EDA could do, and we would recommend that the EDA do, is essentially give you a staff report that evaluates these criteria and this thinking going forward. And so the criteria that we've identified, and I'll just talk a little bit about it again, we'll give this to you in more detail so you can think about it if this makes sense to you, is establish priorities in each phase based on economic drivers. So we really want to think about the project in the context of the economic plan. We want to direct funding to economic strategies. We want to look at our projects catalytic. Are they anchors? But then we also have to think about there's infrastructure needs that support growth. And is this infrastructure investment really helping the DMC vision to get achieved? Is it part of that cost that is, beyond what you would, sort of see normally? And so those are things that we need to think about, and we should be able to report and sort of, assess on your behalf. Consistency findings. We should see if the project matches the plan. We're doing a plan for a reason. It's a strategic plan to guide you all over the next 20 years. So we should tie back to the goals and objectives. We should tie it to the vision, planning documents, and guidelines, and we should tie to the strategies in the business plan. So we should just be able to assess for you, is there a consistency finding? We need to look at the finance plan of projects. We really need to think about, is the finance plan viable? Is the financing in place? If we're looking at several different sources, what you don't want to do is say, okay, here's $10 million of DMC funding, and we hope you get the rest of your financing in place. There needs to be a finance plan that is assessed as you go forward. And importantly, is the operating structure sustainable? Because I think one of the things, maybe the thing I've heard most from folks in the city is don't put all this investment in and then leave us with a bunch of stuff we can't pay for and maintain over time. And so what we really want in the evaluation criteria is not just can you go get the project financed, but can you operate it as you go forward? And is there a verifiable gap? Is the funding needed? This is a typical thing for those of you who've done TIF funding. It's very typical that you would identify a gap, and that's what you would use for TIF funding. This should be thought of in a similar way. You should need the DMC funds because there's going to be a lot of demand for DMC funding going forward. We have added criteria that looks at, does it realize a fiscal benefit that allows the maximization of DMC funds? Now, this is something that we've said, there should be investments that really catalyze and incent development to occur, and that might be, that might increase the investments in the downtown and allow different things to happen. Is the project operating and maintenance cost sustainable? Does it leverage other funds? And then what conditions might be included? Things like, entitlements, conditions, requirements of the law. There will certainly be, in the law, there are targeted business requirements associated with this. But you may also have other policies that you consider going forward that are used as incentives, and Bill can speak a little bit to this, but are used for incentives for things to happen, sustainability initiatives, historic development, affordable housing, those sorts of things. And then finally, Dr. Simmons, I think this is what you were getting at, which is if we're going to change the boundary in the district area, we should be able to evaluate that on a standardized basis as well. And that should really find, we think that there should be a finding that it's of nexus to the core, meaning that it's important to the core strategies and to the core of what we're doing, and that it's essential and catalytic. If we're going to expand or change or, create a new area, the project needs to really be a driver in order to do that. And so again, we're just putting this out there for reaction, because if we're going in the wrong direction, we don't want to fully develop something and then find out, this doesn't work. So I would ask, are there comments and questions?
Again, I think you're going the right direction. That will be in the details like it always is, but I think you're asking the right questions.
I have a,
I-
please.
Sorry, I agree. I think the real heart of this is going to come down to, as we try to prioritize these projects, which ones are, you'll have to do some projections of what fiscal benefits are they going to generate, what kind of revenues can we expect the city to realize, the state to realize. Also, what kind of, as you think about the long run operating sustainability of anything that we build, again, this idea of how much of that is, the city's responsibility or the public responsibility versus private kind of responsibility, and what kind of gains can we expect from these. And those are hard. They're going to be really difficult models to, so you may have to have a couple of different scenarios in those, as we kind of work through those.
Well, and to that point, one of the things we've talked about is a project doesn't necessarily have to meet every one of these criteria in order to be a viable project. Again, you should be able to weigh the pros and cons of these things to really determine what do you want to put the funds there or not.
Yeah. One of the biggest well, to me, one of the priorities will be if it's bringing new money in. Again, if it's building the economic base, and the result is it's actually bringing more money into the economy, that has a higher priority, at least with my way of thinking, than one that is a choice. The dollars are here, and what you're doing is absorbing market that would be somewhere else in the community, and because you can put it here, it comes here because of the DMC dollars. So one has, so you're making a choice between, and it may be very important because from a community development perspective, it feeds what we're trying to do to create the destination and the place, the sense of place. So it's important from that reason. But one that actually grows the economy as opposed to comes in and makes a nicer amenity in this location versus some other location in the community. Those are two different beasts in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's the consistency we're trying to tie to when we say business and economic and workforce and cultural. The cultural sort of gives you that, is this something that, helps us to achieve the plan, but we don't necessarily have a 1,000-person job connected to it, but it's part and parcel to an overall strategy and plan. And I don't know, Bill, if you have anything you want to add to how this sort of tool is used.
And trying to figure out whether we can afford to fund all 5 of them or whether we can only afford to fund 2 of them. And we have to be able to make that decision based on how it's going to contribute to the overall return. And at least in my mind, if I think about it that way, it all makes a little bit more sense.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, sometimes there's so much, in our heads. The objectives were sort of the genesis of this discussion. So I think it would be probably very valuable to go back and try and link to those and show you how in these evaluation criteria, how you're measuring against those. So we'll do that when we give you the...
Well, could I just add one more thing, because it's implicit in the entire conversation we've had about this project is not just a conversation about money. It's a conversation about quality of life.
Right.
And so I think this is so important because we want the people of Rochester and the citizens of the state to be able to look at this and understand what it is that we're talking about when we say this is the return that we're looking for. And it can't just be, an internal rate of return of X, obviously. It's got to be in plain language something that people can understand, especially people who live here.
Thank you. Yes.
I think the other thing we just have to acknowledge up front is that the development district, if you will, isn't an exclusive. Things are going to happen there. They are now, and they'll continue to happen. And some of that may be capturable to help contribute to the economic development in the plan. Others may make us look at how we're going to adapt around it. And I think to the extent that the city with the authority and the DMCC with the authority can really leverage those public monies in a way that helps incent getting the right things done is going to be critical, or no matter how we try to count the return on investment, it isn't going to be enough.
Good point. Good point. Okay, so our next steps are to, based on this feedback, we'll move forward with the boundary. We will get you the finance model and the assumptions behind it and this evaluation criteria in more detail and tie it to the objectives. And that will be the finance plan. So I'm going to let Kimberly talk a little bit now, and then we're going to come back and talk about what the development plan actually has in it at the end.
Amy, will we get those slides, those ones?
Yeah, we'll fix the error that's in the slide, and then if
Yeah,
there's an error.
be good to have, okay, thank you.
Yeah, right.
Meanwhile, this is what overstimulated looks like.
Overstimulated. I haven't even shown you the impact yet. So very excited here to show you the economic and fiscal impacts of the proposed program. And Lisa almost every time opens up her meeting by reminding us that this is an economic development strategy. And so I just wanted to point that out again. It's about an innovative economic development initiative. And here are the numbers that are going to show that this program will actually work. It'll do that. So I will briefly review the baseline economy and remind you how strong the Rochester economy is here. We'll go into the construction and ongoing operations. These are the two types of impacts that we will be measuring. And fiscal impacts, these are essentially the tax revenues that will be generated as a result of the project. So here, the Rochester economy here is very strong, of course, largely driven by Mayo, which has helped it weather through the national recession in much better shape than a lot of other communities, especially of the similar size. And so into the what is an economic impact? What we're going to do is look how an initial investment circulates throughout the regional economy. And so the initial investment, the direct investment, is either the construction costs or it's it's revenues coming into a business. So the indirect and induced impacts result from that, and then you get the total impact. So the indirect impact is when I go into a restaurant and I spend $100 on dinner this evening. The restaurateur will go and buy goods and services in order to serve my needs. So there's food, there's beverage, there's glassware, there's plates, there's linens. All of those are the indirect costs. The induced impacts occur when the restaurateur pays the employees and they in turn go and spend those wages. Those are the induced impacts. Impacts are typically reported out in terms of output, jobs, and wages. So again, you've seen this already today. This is the phasing. This is how we are proposing that the plan be developed over time and the amount of space. And again, I just want to iterate as Amy has, that again, these are assumptions that we're making. And of course, the best laid plans may not always come out the way that we'd like them to, but they are the fundamental assumptions of our economic impact model here today. And if they change, the impacts will also change. Things could happen bigger, smaller, faster, or slower. So for construction costs, we'll look here first. The initial investment, the proposed plan, the construction costs are estimated at $5.9 billion. These are 5-year blocks, of construction investment. So in phase 1, we anticipate nearly $1 billion of investment, and that increases over the 20 years. On top of that, as I said, are the induced and indirect impacts, resulting in a total potential estimated economic impact of $8.3 billion resulting from construction. These are the jobs. So these, instead of cumulative, these are the average annual jobs in each phase for construction, because construction projects often last more than just a single year. And often there's several projects that construction crews could be working on. So it's just an average annual. In the first phase, either the first 5 years, the construction jobs are about 1,100 on average every year of that phase. Induced jobs then are 630. These are jobs that are supporting those businesses. Ongoing operations, again, these are the buildings, the office space, the Mayo space, the hotels, restaurants, retail space that we're proposing. Over the 20-year DMC plan, there's an estimated $47 billion. That's a B, billion, in operating revenues at the proposed businesses over the 20 years. This, in turn, has a total potential economic impact of $68 billion. So, and this money is cumulative, so we're assuming that a hotel that opens in year 1 will actually still be open in year 20. So the hotel, it's not just annual, it's not just what's going on in that phase, because we want to capture the impacts over the whole course of the project. These are the jobs. And again, this is cumulative, so somebody who's working in that hotel that opens up in year 1, still going to be, that job will still exist in year 20. So, and these are total jobs. This is the direct, the indirect, and the induced. And by year 20, we anticipate nearly 52,000 people employed in the region as a result of the DMC investment. And again, in year 1, first year of operations, probably 1,000. And those 1,000 jobs, again, stay through the course of the DMC. Fiscal impacts, these are the tax revenues. Specifically, we're looking here at the city of Rochester, their hotel tax, property tax, and sales tax, and Olmsted County's property tax and sales tax. We worked pretty diligently with the city staff here to understand their city taxes. And again, current conditions are what we used as the base of our assumptions here. So current economic as well as political, and if those change, obviously the fiscal impacts that follow will also be different. This is for the city of Rochester. Under this scenario, the proposed DMC could generate an estimated $279 million in taxes to Rochester over this 20-year period. And again, hotel tax, property tax, and sales tax. Of course, with every formula, there's revenues, there's also costs. Here we worked very closely with the city staff to understand the general fund, and we looked at the revenue streams there. We also looked at the expenditures. And what we did is we projected out over the life of the DMC what the impact could be for the city. And what we found is that there's a small, modest annual gain over the course of the DMC. It starts in the second year, and by the 20th year, it's about $2.4 million that year. So very small share of the total budget. And again, this is based on current assumptions of how taxes are levied here in Rochester. Is there a question?
I was just asking what the city budget was. I was trying to get some scale to this.
So, and again, this is just the general fund that we looked at. So just that specifically. Did Ed answer your question? Okay.
The city general fund budget is about...
Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 150 million, something like that.
The city general fund budget annually?
Our operating budget is about
109.
capital equipment will get over 200.
Thank you. And for Olmsted County, property taxes as well as a sales tax. And we anticipate if the DMC is developed as it's being proposed here, that there'd be an estimated $230 million to the county from these two revenue streams. So in conclusion, I don't have a conclusion slide. I just wanted to say as an economic development initiative, this really does, I was tentative at first when we started this as an economic development plan, and somebody who does economic impact analysis, I always come in cynical. And this program, as proposed here, does actually generate quite a bit of economic development for this region. There are quite a few jobs resulting from this, quite a few new business opportunities, and tax revenues that would help support some of that. So.
And I'd like to add some qualifiers, of course, on the fiscal side. In particular, this assumes that the rate of fiscal revenue stays the same, but grows as the taxing capacity grows because of all the investment here. So that means that total fiscal revenue coming from property taxes in particular grow as the property tax capacity grows. It's not using this base and just increasing it by inflation every year. So that's something that might be a change of recent policy, so that's something to consider. The other is in your property tax system in the state. It's the state can make different choices every year, and that's always a factor. Is a degree of uncertainty. And then lastly is the use of tax increment, because a big source of the operating revenue is coming from property taxes. To the extent that some of the properties might use tax increment, or the city may choose to use tax increment, that takes money that otherwise would go to operating budgets to put into capital budgets, and it may mean you'd have less money to cover estimated fiscal operating costs. So that's just a choice that you'd consider on a case-by-case basis.
And so we didn't, based on historical use of TIF, we didn't make any assumptions about the use of that going forward?
We had the existing TIF, but not going forward on future. So that's an important consideration.
Yes.
And we're modeling, doing some sensitivity models to see what would be the impact if you did utilize TIF on new projects.
Very roughly, in the 20-year period, what are your assumptions about Rochester's population growth versus the visitors who are likely to come and the patients? I mean, a combination of those three has obviously gone into these estimates, but just could we get a sense of that?
Sure. We did look at that for the fiscal cost analysis when we're looking at the general fund, because we needed to know exactly how population might increase.
Right.
And one of the things that's really interesting we learned from looking at current data is that about half of the people who work in Rochester also live in Rochester. So in addition to the residential units that we're building, all of these jobs that we're creating here as a result of the proposed plan will also generate new residents. So off the top of my head, I don't want to give you a number, but I will make sure that you get that number about residents. But it is something that we have evaluated very closely, because when we looked at the fiscal revenues and the fiscal costs for the city, we did have to look at some instances by per capita. So we do know, we do have an estimate.
So approximately of the 57,000 jobs, what you're saying is about 30,000 will be living here and about 30,000 will be coming from outside.
It's 53%.
53%, okay.
Yeah, and of course that could change and it would be influenced by the city's general plan. One thing we did when we looked at the fiscal costs, it was the fiscal cost to the city, not fiscal costs just in the DMC. So you have people who work in DMC, live elsewhere in the city, incur fiscal services, city services, regardless of where they live in the city.
It's a good question, because it goes back to Tina's comment earlier about, is there enough are there going to be enough people here to support the markets that are being created? So yes. Mm-hmm.
And the follow-up kind of related to that, did you take into account any additional school district costs?
No, the school districts are a separate budget item, and we did not look at that. But it's a very important question. Because obviously adding 25,000 residents who are going to be working here also will certainly impact the school districts.
Other comments? That was a Steve session. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. So we're on the home stretch, everybody. Very excited. We're going to talk a little bit about process now, and we'll wrap this up so we can all get prepared for public testing.
I know after 4 hours or 3 hours and 45 minutes, nothing excites any of us more than process, but we have to, I just want to touch base on this quickly. We had talked earlier, and this was the slide that I inserted because it should have been there before, but I do think it's important to always go back to these goals and objectives. And as we've come to the home stretch, one of the things that we've really been doing very diligently is really going back and testing the master plan and the transportation plan and the infrastructure plan, the finance models and the business strategies, and all the things that we're pulling together. We're testing them against the goals, and we're testing them against the objectives that you all set back in September to make sure that we can answer that question. So in the development plan, there will actually be, in the executive summary, a summary that says this is where these things are found and how we have recognized the importance of them throughout the plan. The development plan, a while ago, you all had approved a content outline for the development plan, and of course that's morphed and changed over time. And I wouldn't say it's not gotten smaller. So, Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to just take a little moment to just talk about what is in there as of right now. The executive summary, and again, reiterates the goals and objectives, has a summary of the public process, the development district, the vision, and what have you. We'll then have a capital improvement plan that's related to phase one. That is a requirement that we must put together, and we have to really think about that, and we got some good feedback today on the methodology for that, because I think when we started this, we thought, well, maybe it will be, specific projects, but I think over time what we've learned is it's much more dynamic than that. And so that will be there. We'll do a summary of the strategic and operational priorities, development plan findings. This relates to actually specific findings that are in the law that the DMCC board must find that these things are included. So we'll have a summary for you in the development plan. The market research, which you saw months ago, has advanced, and case studies have been added to that now. The master plan that Peter and Hillary are so diligently working on will come together. The transportation plan as well will come together into a comprehensive document. Infrastructure plan, the economic impact report that Kimberly just went through, the finance plan that I just went through will be detailed and have all the assumptions and talk about O&M and as well as cost for program activation. Then we have business plans, community outreach, marketing plans, and the operations plan, which you all approved not too long ago, but which in this plan now looks at a 5-year growth in budgeting process per the requirements. And then there's a series of appendices that I won't go into. So that is where we're at. It's coming together very well, and that's it. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. Sorry, just quickly. We are on track to submit December 17th. And then based on the conversation earlier today, I think that the February date may extend into March. That makes some sense from the standpoint of just how detailed this is. And so you may see over time that shifts a little bit, but we're on track to submit in December.
Well, thank you. I think that they might look forward to this particular moment in the day, or in the week that we've been working today. This session, I cannot tell you how valuable it is, and really engaging our two boards together with all of our planners and consultants and management. We'll take this discussion back to the EDA board and in the management group and process it and be back to you, and look forward to your considering a development plan we proposed December 17th. Thank you. Chair Smith, would you like to say any concluding words today? And I said concluding words
Just a big
today.
thank you. That's all.
Great. Thank you, everyone.